So we're going to start out with the absolute basics here. First things first, this is my dashboard. I've customized it with a number of different services that I need to regularly see. You can tell that I'm running out of credit on my account, but thankfully I've only got one more day left until the £75 a month refreshes. But what we're going to do, we're going to create a virtual machine, a Windows virtual machine, a network interface and VNet, a subnet for that VNet, and a storage account for diagnostics. I'm going to go up to the top left hand corner and click on Create a Resource, which will bring up the Azure Marketplace blade. In the Azure Marketplace blade, we can pick from any of the resources that you can build in the portal from a huge list. They're divided up by category, and then there's also a popular column. At the top of the popular column is Windows Server 2016 Data Center, which is what we're going to be building. However, I just want to give you a quick guide to the other available Windows SKUs. So I'm going to type in Windows Server and select that. And we can see in the drop down there are a lot of different available SKUs for Windows servers. We can go back as far as Windows 2008 R2, which seems odd because that's end of life this year, but we have all sorts of different options available. We are going to choose the small disk Windows Server 2016 Data Center option and then click Create. In the first blade, the Creator Virtual Machine blade, we select our subscription firstly. I only have my Microsoft Partner Network subscription available, but you might have a pay-as-you-go subscription, or you might have a free subscription that's set up for a year of credit. We either pick from an existing resource group, or, as we're going to do, we create a new one. I'm going to keep everything in one place for these tutorials, so I'm going to call this AZ-103 Lab. We need to give it a name. Again, I'm going to keep this very simple, so I'm going to call it AZ-103 Demo VM 1, and I'm going to build that in the UK South data center, which is near to where I live. The different options, we'll get to this in a later video, but the different options will determine different prices. So for example, if you pick from a data center in France, it's actually considerably more expensive than provisioning locally. For the time being, we're going to keep the availability options to no infrastructure redundancy required, because I'm going to cover that in a later video. We've already picked our image. We now have to pick our SKU size. So I'm going to click on Change Size. There are actually far more than these available as different Azure SKUs. However, what we have here is we have a filter of small and generation 2, general purpose, that support premium disks. I'm going to pick the cheapest option, which is a B series. B series are burstable VMs, which run a lot cheaper in terms of they run less IOPS when they're not in use. We found a good production reason for a burstable VM is to hold Flex LM licenses, but generally you would use a burstable VM for a non-production workload. We also have available here the DS3 series V2, which in comparison to our B1S, which is £5.82 if running 24/7 for a month, is £326.05. So as you can see, there are a lot of difference. There's a lot of difference based on how many virtual cores you need, how much RAM you need. So I'm going to select the RB1S, click select. I'm going to give it a username and password. And then for now, I'm going to leave none as the available inbound public ports. And I don't have a Windows Server license bar my MPN ones, so I'm going to leave that ticked as no. And then move on to the disks blade. So initially we can select our operating system disk type from 3 SKUs: standard, HDD, and then standard or premium solid state. The differences between them are essentially IOPS related. So I've just pulled up the website here that details the differences between these different SKUs. They also obviously have a different cost associated with them. So if you pick a standard HDD, it's going to be a lot cheaper than a premium solid state disk. There is a lot of data on the potential sizes and IOPS caps. And just to note that a lot of this information is there's a lot of information to digest on the Microsoft website about all of these services in Azure. So just to keep the price down for the time being, I'm going to pick a standard platter-based hard drive. It tells me that the standard VM's size supports premium disks and that they recommend premium disks for high IOPS workloads. And the SLA is affected by the selection of a premium SSD. Additionally, we can add data disks. I will create and attach a solid state disk. I'm going to keep the default name and change it ever so slightly. Actually, no, I'm going to keep that the same. I don't have a source at the moment, I don't have a snapshot, and I don't have any blob storage containing a disk image. I'm just going to bring down the size of it because we pay per gigabyte of provision space. So I'm going to keep it as small as possible and select 1 gigabyte and then hit OK. And then next we're going to move on to networking. We don't currently have a virtual network, so we're going to create a new one. I'm going to keep their default name of AZ-103 Lab VNet. I'm going to call it Lab VNet 1. Whoops, 1. I'm going to give it an address range of 256 addresses, seems fairly sensible. And then within those 256 addresses, I'm going to pull down the subnet so that it is, actually no, I'm going to go 16 addresses in the subnet of that, and I'm going to call that demo subnet and click OK. I do not want to give it a public IP at present, so I'm going to click none. Now the network security group, I'm going to keep a basic network security group. I'll move on to talking about NSGs in a separate video, but we will use that basic NSG SKU to determine changes that can be made to the communication to and from this VM. At present, we've got no public inbound ports, so nothing outside of the subnet demo subnet can talk to this VM at present. Accelerated networking is off because the SKU of VM I've picked doesn't support it. And at present, the load balancing I'm going to keep as no, because again, I'm going to cover that later. So here we have our management blade. I've got a few options here on monitoring. So for example, we've got boot diagnostics, which can help you determine issues about why your VM isn't starting up, for example. We've got OS guest diagnostics, which are more to do with the specific operating of the VM itself. I'm going to switch that on. To actually create these diagnostics, we need a storage account. So I'm going to click here on create new. I'm going to change the name of it slightly to AZ-103 lab diagnostic. We're going to retain the general purpose V1 storage tier, keep the performance at standard, and the cheapest option of locally redundant storage, which means that the data is replicated within the same data center. You wouldn't go to a higher tier if you're worried that there will be a data center outage and you would potentially lose your data. But for the sake of the boot diagnostics for our demo, I'm just going to pick the cheapest option here. I'm not going to assign assign managed identity because we don't yet have any Azure AD set up, so we can't yet implement that. And I am going to switch on an auto shutdown schedule. So we've got it set up at the default of 7 o'clock in the evening on UTC, and we can put in an email address to be notified when that is shut down, which I'm gonna keep my own email address in there. Just click OK to our storage account, and then move into advanced. I am actually going to skip the advanced settings for the time being and move on to tagging. So I'm going to give a couple of standard tags here. I'm going to give it a cost center tab, and I'm going to give that a value of 100,000. And then I'm going to give it a type, and I'm going to describe it as a development VM. And then finally, if we click on review and create, it will show us all of the options that we've picked thus far. I paused the video for a few minutes while it was just carrying out the final validation there. What it does is it validates against the policies applied to the subscription to determine that everything we've set up, so the VNet, the storage account, the VM, all conform to any policies that are applied on the subscription itself. Now, before I actually click create, I can just look at a couple of details, and it does actually show you the exact price per hour in pounds. And one very important part that I'm going to do here is I'm going to download the ARM template for the deployment. I'm going to click download here and save. That gives us a very helpful zip file for redeployment of the ARM template that includes the template itself, which shows all of the items that we've actually decided to provision. So you can see the NIC is there. What else do we have? We have the data disk, the virtual machine itself. These are all determined in the order that they need to be there, so it will create any dependencies in the order that they need to be created. And then the parameters themselves are stored in a separate JSON file, which are all of the options that we picked to create the VM. So if I go back to my create virtual machine, I'm going to hit create. And we can now see that it is deploying to the AZ-103 resource group. So if I now go to my resource groups blade, and there's the AZ-103 lab resource group. And we can see that it's moving along at a fair old clip. We already have 2 disks, 1 network interface, our NSG, our storage account, and our VNet. And you can click here to the deployments, and it will show the progress of the deployments. I'm going to pause the video here rather than watching the deployments continue, and resume it once everything's complete. So we can now see that the deployment has succeeded. In 12 minutes and 15 seconds it took to deploy everything for our standard Windows VM. If I go to overview on the resource group, you can see here, there is our virtual machine. I click on the link. And you can see that the status of the VM is stopped deallocated, which means that our automatic shutdown schedule has kicked in. You can actually see it switch itself off there. There we are. So in the next video I intend to dig a bit deeper on the ARM templates that we saved earlier, and I will see you next time.